help them with their analysis of the data that everyone submitted for hours of instruction and expenditures for the PY 2018-2019 period, which I've done, and I'm going to talk about that. Also, I had, as a subcontractor to CLASP, which many of you may be familiar with, I did the analysis of those data for PY 2017-2018. And so basically, I've done the analysis of these data now for the last couple of years and kind of in a position to talk a little bit about what's changed from year to year, et cetera. So I'd like to do 4 things this morning. It's afternoon for me, by the way, because I'm in Illinois. But in any case, I'd like to do 4 things. Give a little bit of background about this work, then spend most of the time walking you through the results of what we found when we looked at the data that you had all submitted. I have some recommendations. That's the 3rd thing I wanted to review with you. These are recommendations that are my recommendations to the state CAEP office. They may or may not be implementing these, but we can maybe talk about that. But I just wanted you to be aware of what those recommendations are. And then most of the time, or half the time, I think I'd like to reserve, if we can, for your questions and discussion. So I'll let you know when we get to that point. We'll unmute people, et cetera, so you can do that. And in the meantime, as Veronica said, feel free to use your chat to kind of, put in your questions as they occur to you. And then I'll be looking at that chat dialogue and trying to answer as many questions as I possibly can given the time available. So, background. As you know, for 2017-2018, the state office implemented a new data collection process through NOVA to collect the information on hours and expenditure. So program expenditures and hours of instruction reports that were required to be submitted to the state CAEP office for that first year, and we analyzed those data and made a number of recommendations to the state office as a result of that first round of data reporting, which was the first, it was the first time we tried doing all this, so there was a lot of rough edges to it, as you probably recall. And so we made a number of recommendations, and the ones I've shown here on this background slide are the recommendations that the state office implemented between that first round of reporting and the most recent round of reporting that we're going to talk about today. So first, just to tick those off for those of you who may be new to this or who may be forgotten what it is that got changed, the reporting requirements for hourly instruction were clarified to avoid any duplication of hour reporting between CTE and workforce reentry, which is now called workforce prep. So we clarified that. Secondly, we defined instructional hour and contact hour in a way that was meant to conform better with federal requirements. Third, the request for reporting of services hours was dropped, right? So that's not required any longer, just instructional hours. Fourth, for K-12 and COE, County Office of Education, guidance was provided regarding the tracking of hours of instruction for integrated courses. So courses that combine features of occupational instruction and academic instruction across due to some program categories. Instruction was provided on improving the way in which those hours should be allocated to those 2 types of things. Fifth, the fund source expenditure allocation reporting requirement was simplified. It was separated into required fund sources and optional fund sources. So the required fund sources are CAEP, WEO Title II, non-credit apportionment, CalWORKS, Perkins, LCFF, and jail ed funds, fees, and in-kind. Those are the required ones, and all the other ones are optional, which means contracted services, community college supported services, donations, WEO Title I, ITAs, other federal grants, other state grants, and strong workforce. So all those were made optional, and the other ones are the ones that you see at the top of that list are the required ones. And we'll get into that in more detail as we talk about who reported what kinds of funds and in the actual reporting of expenditures. And then finally, definitions of in-kind and fees or program income were aligned with applicable WEO Title II definitions and reporting requirements. And all of these changes and clarifications were communicated with consortium members back a year ago and also covered in webinars and presentations at the CAEP Summit back in October 2019. And just as a reminder, those of you who were at the CAEP Summit, I was privileged to be in attendance at that CAEP Summit and make a presentation. I unfortunately won't be able to do that this year. So this kind of webinar sort of substitutes for that, where we're going to go over what we found out and what we think it means. And then, so then we launched into our second round of data collection for hours and expenditures for PY 2018-2019, and that was, as was done the first iteration, that was done in two phases. And estimated hours and expenditure data was submitted on September 1st, and then the final or certified hour and expenditure data was requested by December 1st of last year. And then on the 10th of December, the state sort of, drove stake in the ground and said, we're done. Everyone's had enough time now to report those data. And we had 66 of the 71 consortia submitting certified reports, and that represented 392 CAEP member organizations, which isn't everybody, but it's it's almost everybody. So given all that, then the state office asked me to help them with these 5 things that you see on this slide now. They wanted me to characterize hours of instruction by program area. They wanted me to characterize expenditures by program area and fund type, because for expenditures, we're collecting 2 types of information, expenditures by program and expenditures by fund type. So both those things they wanted me to look at. And then number 3, they wanted me to compare those first 2 things across provider types, particularly K-12, community college, and we created an other category, which frankly hardly has anything in it. So it's basically K-12 and community colleges. And then 4th, they asked me to compare all of that, all of 1, 2, and 3, across the 2 years, PY 2017-18 and PY 2018-19. And finally, to look at some data quality issues in terms of, how did we think we did? Did the data quality get better, worse, sideways? What happened with the data quality? So that's what I want to get into now. So we're going to spend most of these slides. We got maybe, I don't know, a dozen or so slides. We'll go through those results, and please take notes. And if you have questions, we'll come back and we'll get into the details of particular questions that you might have. But I'm just going to take these things, one at a time through 1 through 5. So first thing, hours of instruction. For hours of instruction, we looked at 3 things. We looked at what programs have the greatest number of hours. How is that different across the different types of providers, K-12 schools and community colleges? And then how does PY 2019 compare to PY 2018, right? So figure 1, this first pie chart shows the percentage distribution of hours of instruction by program area. So taken together, as you probably are not surprised to hear, ESL, EL Civics, short-term CTE, and ABE, ASE account for the vast majority. In fact, 91.4% of all instructional hours provided in 2019 were in one of those 3 categories, the green, the blue, and the orange, if you will. And the rest of it is very small by comparison. This next slide shows table 1, which drills down into that in a little bit more detail. This shows the totals and percentages of hours of instruction by program area and provider type. So if you look at the right-hand side of that table where you see the highlighted column of row percent, that corresponds to the pie chart that you just looked at, figure 1. And across the bottom, the highlighted area shows the percentage distribution across the 2 main, or the 3 provider types. But as I said, there's really only 2 as far as any appreciable amount of expenditures or hours of instruction, either one, frankly. But this does show the breakout between the 2 primary types of providers. So just to remind folks, the K-12 category, I've grouped this together to simplify things into these 3 categories. K-12 school districts include elementary school districts, high school districts, unified school districts, county offices of education, charter schools, joint powers associations, and regional occupational programs. And those providers, that group of providers together accounted for about 2/3 or 67.5% of the hours of instruction. The other major group, of course, is community colleges, and that's community colleges and community college districts account for about 1/3 or 32.4% of all of the hours of instruction. And with a tiny little rounding error amount that goes to other providers, which includes workforce development boards, libraries, community-based organizations, and the like, that small amount there. All right, table 2, we're still on hours of instruction now, but here table 2 compares the hours of instruction by program area across the 2 program years, 18 and 19. So there's substantial increase in the number of instructional hours for ABE, ASE, and substantial decreases in hours for K-12 success and workforce prep. But overall, the hours are about the same across the 2 years. So very little difference in the total hours, about 65 million hours of instruction, which is a lot of hours. But the distribution changed a lot. And we think, or I think, that has something to do with changes in definitions of some of the categories, some of the program categories perhaps, or some clarification about how hours get allocated between one thing and another that resulted in this reduction, say, in workforce prep, and some increases perhaps in some of the other categories. So, but I think it's interesting to see that even though total hours didn't really change that much from one year to the next, there was a lot of shifting in the program categories between one year and the next. All right, so that was hours. Now we're going to turn our attention to expenditures. And so for expenditures, we looked at essentially the same basic questions. What programs have the highest expenditures? What fund sources have the highest expenditures? I mean, which fund sources have the highest expenditures associated with them? How do those expenditures vary across the different types of providers? Again, same question as we asked before. And then how does 2019 compare to 2018? So a very similar set of questions. And this first figure shows the expenditure distribution by program area. So it's analogous to that, first pie chart that you saw for hours. And it's very similar in its results too. But almost all the expenditures fall into one of those 3 categories: ESL, EL Civics, short-term CTE, and ABE, ASE. And they're not identical. The expenditures are maybe a little bit higher for ESL, EL Civics relative to hours. I'm sorry, they're a little bit lower relative to hours. The spending for short-term CTE is about the same as the hours were, and the spending for ABE, ASE is a little bit higher than the hour utilization was, and there's some other minor changes. But they're fairly similar just in overall terms between the 2, which, you would expect because things cost what they cost, and if you're spending money, if you're providing hours of instruction, you're spending money in that category, so they ought to match up reasonably closely, at least at this aggregate level for the whole state. So now this next chart shows the second thing we looked at, which is in addition to reporting expenditures by program area, the state office requires consortia to allocate expenditures for each program across the various funds that contributed to those program expenditures. And there's a long list of funds, as you can see there. So, and the reason for this is so that the CAEP office can have a more complete picture of how locally available fund sources are being leveraged to support the operation of CAEP programs. So this figure shows the percentage distribution of expenditures by fund source type. And what jumps out here, of course, is that nearly 84% of all expenditures fall into one of those first 3 fund types: California Adult Education Program, or formerly AEBG, non-credit apportionment, and we owe Title II AFL funds, right? Reporting the expenditures associated with each of these fund types is required, as is reporting for fees, in-kind contributions, CalWorks, LCFF, K-12 adult ed jail funds and Perkins funds. And all the rest of the funds that are on that chart there are not required, so not surprisingly, with the exception of maybe contracted services, hardly anything in any of those. So again, that wasn't terribly surprising, but maybe a little bit that there were so few funds associated with some of those fund categories. I might have expected to see maybe a little bit more on some of those other ones, but anyway, that is the result from at the state level for fund type. So then we drill down into that a little bit. Well, you're looking at those expenditures by program type. Okay, so we have hours by program type, and we have expenditures by program type. So this table shows that broken down by provider type. So down the left-hand side, you got your programs, and the columns are the types of providers. And those the highlighted row percent on the right-hand side of that table corresponds to that pie chart I showed you a minute ago. And this across the bottom is the distribution of the expenditures across basically the two provider types. So for 2018-2019, over $812 million were expended by CAEP providers. Nearly 3/4 of that was done by K-12 schools and about 1/4 by community colleges and community college districts. So the distribution of total spending by program areas between the two provider types is similar, but not identical to the expenditures or the distribution of the hours, if you will, across the two provider types. So, for instance, whereas I'm just checking back here on my other slide. Oh yeah, as hours, community colleges were 32, about 1/3 of the hours, 32.4%, and they're about 26% of the expenditures. K-12 districts were about 2/3 of hours, but they're about 3/4 of spending. So those are some interesting differences there in terms of the distribution of those two things between the two provider types, whether you're looking at hours or whether you're looking at expenditures. So then the next thing we looked at was how did this change from year to year, from 2018 to 2019 by major program category. And you can see there, this is table 4, that compares the expenditures across two program years by program type. So there were some substantial increases in expenditures for K-12 success, ABE, ASC, and AWD, adult workforce development. There were substantial decreases in expenditures for workforce preparation, which again may be related to some definitional changes there, pre-apprenticeships and short-term CTE. So all those had reductions, but overall expenditures were almost identical. We're in the prior years down slightly, which could be due to the fact that we had a couple fewer consortia report, I think, in this latest round than we had in the first round. So that alone could probably explain the reduction in the expenditure total, but it's pretty close. But there are some interesting differences in types of program categories in terms of changes from year to year, and some of them are pretty significant. All right, so that is hours and expenditures and time 1, time 2, and provider types, all the basic things that they wanted me to have a look at are shown there. And then, so then last thing I did was I kind of looked at data quality questions. And so for data quality, I was really looking at a handful of things. And I'll go over these because I think it's an important issue with respect to, what do we do going forward with this requirement? So I looked at compliance with the reporting requirement. I looked at consistency within reports, like consistency between hours and expenditures. Are those things relate to each other? Which would be good if they were, right? And I looked at extreme values, because then when you have lots of extreme values, that can make it difficult to make use of the data. And then I looked at year-to-year consistency for individual members. Like how at the individual member level, did things change a lot from year 1 to year 2? And because that could be like a little red flag as well, right? So those are the things I looked at for data quality, and I got some tables and charts and stuff for each of those things I want to go over with you if I could here. So first, Table 5 answers the question, to what extent did members and consortia comply with the reporting requirement? So Table 5 shows the number and percent of CAEP members who either did not submit a report or submitted a report with 0 total expenditures or 0 total hours of instruction. Now you might say, how can you do that? Well, you can, and many did. Probably shouldn't be able to. We'll get to that in a second. But we had, just to pick some numbers here, we had, in 2019, we had 38 members. These are all members, right? We had 38 members that submitted a report, a certified report with 0 expenditures. We had 46 that submitted a certified report with 0 hours of instruction, right? So, and we had, a couple dozen that submitted 0 hours of instruction in both years, both 18 and 19, right? So, so I would say that, we've got some compliance questions here around at the member level, at least around the utilization of the report. Now, some of it could be, some of it, yes, one year and not the other year could be, members coming and going from existence. I was a consortium member in 19, but not in 18 or vice versa. But I tried to control over that by only applying this to places where I had identified the member as being present in both years. In other words, at least present as far as the report was submitted by them, right? So these weren't like failures to submit. I mean, they're big, like they were there, but they weren't submitting a report, basically. In other words, they existed, but we didn't have a report for them. So how exactly you interpret that probably depends upon your knowledge of what's going on actually on the ground with particular consortia. But I think it's something that you'd want to follow up on and give a better understanding of what's going on. All right, the next thing, and I apologize for the size of this slide here, but I think we'll be getting these slides to everyone so that you have them at your disposal and can look at them at your leisure. But so beyond with the overall compliance with the reporting requirement, did I not submit a report with something in it, to what extent do members actually provide information for each of the major report data elements? So that's what Table 6 shows. The percent of members providing a non-zero response to each of the major report elements. Now, these are not all the report elements, because as I'm sure you recall, there's hundreds of report elements, but these are just the major ones. Like the top group are the major totals for hours of instruction for the whole member. And the second is the major expenditure categories by program, at the member level. And then the last group are all the fund source categories. And the ones above the line are, the ones that have the asterisk are the required ones. So as you can see, there's really only I think 8, highlighted those 8 cells there. Those are the 8 categories for which a majority of members provided some non-zero response, right? So in other words, most categories, particularly when you look at expenditures by fund category, most of the fund categories really just aren't used by most members, right? So I think that raised some question about, whether, the effort that goes into actually, frankly, gathering all that fund category stuff and whether you're really getting much for that, because really there's not a lot of members reporting basically on any of those categories. All right, so beyond compliance and did people submit data, et cetera, then I wanted to look at kind of the more of the technical level, at the kind of the consistency within the report themselves. And so the first thing I looked at was the relationship between expenditures and hours of instruction. So that's what Figure 4 does. It's a scatter plot, and it has colored dots on it, blue for community colleges, red for K-12, and green for other. And there, again, not a lot of others, but they're all on there together in this slide. And this is, so each dot on this graph represents a member. And it's positioned on the graph in accordance with the relationship between their total 2019 expenditures and their total 2019 hours of instruction. And if they were one of those members that had zeros in either one of those categories, they're not on this slide. This is just people with non-zero results. And it's also a log chart, which means that as you go to the right or as you go from low to high, each of those lines is 10 times greater than the one below it or to the left of it. So that's just done so we can get all these dots on the slide and you can sort of see what's going on without them all being crowded down in one corner, which is what you would have if it wasn't for that. If it wasn't for the fact that you use a log chart to display the data. So the real question that this gets at is that are the underlying values that would be used to create a cost per result, which are hours of instruction and expenditures, right? Are those related to each other in some kind of predictable manner? In other words, do members with high reported hours of instruction also have high reported expenditures? And with those with low reported hours of instruction have low reported expenditures? That's really what we're getting at here. And so what this plot suggests is that this is similar to what we saw in the original data, that the relationship between expenditures and hours of instruction is relatively close for K-12 providers and less so for community colleges. And that, again, that's a pattern that we saw before. And so in order to see that a little bit more clearly, I created the next two scatter plots, which separate those two types of providers apart. So you can see on the left-hand side, community colleges are obviously a lot fewer of them, and they're much more randomly organized there. And then the large number of K-12 providers on the right-hand slide, a little bit more disciplined grouping, if you will, around that. So in a higher R, the R squareds, and you probably can't see those because they're tiny, but the R squareds there show they're reasonably decent in both cases, really. But so there's a decent relationship for both sets of providers, but still it's stronger for the K-12 providers in terms of the relationship between hours and spending, which is what you would expect to see if people were reporting real stuff. All right, so then the next thing I looked at was, what does this look like when we plot expenditures against the cost per hour? So if we computed, so what I did is I computed the cost per hour total, all expenditures, all hours. It's not, it's not broken down by program, it's just everything. I computed a total cost per hour. That's along the x-axis. The y-axis is the expenditures, the 2019. And this is all 2019. And again, but the three provider types. So overall, there's not great correlation between that. So, and so then this is a little easier to see when you break it down, which the next slide does, between two different types of providers, community colleges and K-12. Now, so you would expect, I'll just make it personal. I would expect that if you're doing a really good job of measuring hours and expenditures, you might expect that there would be economies of scale, and you'd be able to see that in the data. In other words, big providers would have somewhat lower unit costs than little bitty providers because they have economies of scale that smaller providers don't appreciate. So you would expect to see some correlation. In other words, those cost pers being lower for the bigger guys. And you don't really see that so much. So I'm not sure why that is, and it's okay if it's not. It's just one check I looked at. There is a little bit tighter relationship for the K-12 than there is for community colleges, which look to be like pretty much completely random. But there's a little bit of relationship that goes the opposite direction of what I might have expected for the K-12 providers. But neither one of those has much of an R square associated with it. So I didn't find it what I was looking for there. All right, so the sort of last couple things we looked at on data quality was extreme values and year-to-year member consistency. And that's what's on these two tables here, Table 7 and Table 8. Table 7 looks at members that reported low values in 2019. And these two low values, $50,000 of total expenditures and 1,000 hours of instruction, are arbitrary. I just picked those because they seem to me that that's a pretty low amount to have as a member. Now, it could be members, I should mention, it's possible that there are members that have different functions that are not necessarily instructionally related, for instance, and they might have very low hours of instruction. And so that could possibly explain some of the 31 there with less than 1,000 hours of instruction. But as a general rule of thumb, it seemed to me that, you know, we'd be interested in somebody whose expenditures were, or hours were, that low. And about, you know, nearly 8% of total members had report hours of instruction of less than 1,000, and about 6% or 5.5% had less than $50,000 of spending, and 3% had both of those things. So that group there, that 13, is, I think, of particular interest as to whether this is a relevant requirement for them, given the size or what's actually going on, or whether that's accurate. And then the table 8 looks at year-to-year consistency at the member level. And again, this is a little arbitrary on my part, but I just think that if members are accurately reporting their hours and expenditures, then we wouldn't necessarily expect to see huge differences in total expenditures or hours of instruction from 18 and 19, since there have not been large changes in available funding. Now, that's a caveat there. We might see large differences in particular programs or particular fund categories, of course, because there's a lot of variation in reporting instructions, et cetera. And it's possible that we might see large variation at the member level if we had new members or retiring members, or some other reason why at the member level there have been major changes in funding for a particular member. But it kind of jumped out at me that we had so many members with relatively large changes in total expenditures or hours of instruction from one year to the next. So for instance, 81 of the 360 members who reported expenditures in both years, 81 or 22.5% had a variation of greater than 25% from year one to year two, and 120 of 348 who reported hours in both years, or over a third, had greater than 25% variation in the hours of instruction, which seemed to me, and then it could be dead wrong in this, but it just seemed to me that was pretty high as a just total variation going on from one year to next year, and implies at least there might be something going on with reporting compliance, say, or understanding of the reporting requirement. And I would want to take a closer look at that if I was the state CAEP office. Okay, finally, I came up with some of these recommendations, which probably aren't news to you. Maybe. The first is just some technical stuff. I think are important. I'm not sure they can all be done, but there seem to me to be things that would be like sort of relatively straightforward things that, if they could be done, could dramatically improve reporting quality and completeness going forward. The first is like standardizing member names across reports. Like I had to find people in the 2 different years, the names had changed, the spelling and the way the name was presented or described, it altered from one year to the next. It would be super cool to like standardize that so a member's called what a member's called from one year to the next. It makes it a lot easier to find them in the data and make sure that things are matching up. Secondly, we probably ought to prohibit report certification with 0 entries. So you had 21 members that submitted certified reports with 0 entries for hours instruction, and 14 that did so for expenditures. So really, strictly speaking, if you don't have anything to say, you probably shouldn't be able to certify your report. Third, we ought to require consistency. These last 2 are a little harder, I recognize, but I think it would be great if we could do it. Require consistency between hours and expenditure entries at the program level. By the main, not the funds, but the program categories. It shouldn't be possible to certify a report with hours of instruction in a program category where you don't have any expenditures, or expenditures with no hours of instruction. So if you're doing, ABEASE, then you need to have, if you've got money, if you've spent ABEASE money, then you probably ought to have hours of instruction for ABEASE and vice versa, right? So that's just like a consistency check at the program level between the different types of things. If you're doing adult workforce development, then you need to have, if you're doing one, they should have both things, expenditures and hours. And then finally, if we could, we ought to try to link report requirements to records of fund availability at the member level. So in other words, if we know that a member has been funded to do X program, ESL, EL Civics, say. We know they've been funded to do that. Then there should be something in the report. They should have some expenditures and hours associated with that. Now, if you have members out there that are not instructionally, their mission is not instructional, they don't have hours of instruction, they shouldn't have hours of instruction, they probably should be exempted from the report requirement because it's not relevant to them. This is about people that are doing instruction. The whole point of this is to figure out what's going on between spending and hours, right? So if you don't do hours, then you shouldn't be in this report. It's just cluttering it up. Sorry, I have a tendency to be more candid than perhaps I should. But anyway, then these last set of recommendations are more policy-oriented. And these are all things that are kind of just continuations of work that's already being done. And I just wanted to encourage the office to continue to do that, continue to support consortia and members with training and TA on the reporting policy and procedure, including best practices for allocating costs. Continue to work with consortia and members to gather input to make further improvements in a policy and procedure going forward and how to make best use of the data. And I know those things have been going on. And then this fourth one is, I think, a new idea, and that is that the state office should provide feedback to members on their reporting results, including unit cost estimates, prior to member submission of revised reports. And what I mean by that is that it would be, I think, really helpful for members to be able to see what the implications of their report are with respect to things like unit cost at the program level. So in other words, according to the data you sent in last time, you said your unit cost per hour for ESL, EL Civics was $1,500. And then people can look at that and say, that's not right. I probably ought to look at what I said there and see if I can get that a little closer to what's actually going on, right? So that would be helpful, that kind of feedback loop in any kind of data collection system. If you don't have a good feedback loop, you're not going to get good data. That's just a bottom line. And I think creating that kind of feedback loop would be super helpful to improving the quality of data over time. If you're going to have this requirement, you might as well, take it seriously and get that feedback in place so you can get the data where you want it to be. And then finally, I felt that the office should consider options in addition to everything else I've said to improve compliance with the reporting requirement. Once everything, once all these other recommendations have been done, then this compliance with reporting requirement and how utilization of data, all that stuff should go into the regular monitoring process for members. So that monitoring ought to include, are people taking this requirement seriously? Are there what kind of problems they run into? What can we do to help make this better at the member level? So we have so we can just work on making that better over time. Okay, there. I took up slightly more time than I wanted to, but I wanted to make sure I got through these things. So I'm going to, with Veronica's help, I'm going to open this up and answer questions that you may have. Let me look at my chat log. Well, there's a lot of stuff in the chat log. Okay. I'm going to take these, not necessarily, I'm just going to take these in the order I see them, if that's okay. Let's see here. Scrolling down through the greetings. Veronica, can people see my Zoom chat on my screen or not? Or are they just relying on me to get it right?
No, we're all looking at the same Zoom chat. And so
okay.
The first question related to the content, I believe, and there was a question from Frank regarding service hours. And then
this one from Frank?
Yes. And this was more of a general question to the audience regarding concern about service hours.
Right, and that's a good question, Frank. I think that that was a significant change that was made to the policy from year 1 to year 2, and I think, and I don't want I'm not, if there's state office folks on the call, I would encourage you to weigh in here on this. But my impression of that is that there were a lot of issues that came up around reporting service, tracking service hours. What it's a service, what's a service hour, you know, how do you know what's what and how do you keep track of it? No one, a lot of people really weren't doing that. They didn't really have a mechanism for doing it, et cetera. So I think all of those things together kind of led the state to say, you know, maybe we should just, that was a bridge too far, we should back off of that. So if the feeling is that, you know, that's still a requirement or an itch that needs to be scratched, we probably ought to talk. There needs to be some sort of dialogue go on around how maybe to approach that, I guess. Okay. This is great. All right. Yeah. Okay. We kind of taught that. We covered that, right? And there's the PowerPoint. Excellent. Is there a definition description list of what each of those fund source types are? I believe there is in the reporting instructions. Now, don't ask me to quote you the issuance number, but I'm sure that someone else could provide that. That went out back prior to this most recent round of reporting. I know as part of that clarification or part of that reporting issuance, I think there was some definitional stuff put out on those, on the fund source types, what they were, what was required, and what their definitions were.
And Tim, I posted the document into the chat.
Oh, good for you. Thank you so much. Okay. I mean, wary to putting too much faith in expenditures by fund source. Yeah, I would too, Andrew. Be wary of putting too much faith in expenditures by fund source, but because I don't know that we have cracked the code on how really at the member level, and again, this is Tim's opinion only, so don't take this to the bank because state might feel differently about this, but my feeling is that I don't know that we've cracked the code on how to properly recognize those costs at the member level and how to properly associate them with the appropriate fund source. So I think there's a lot of variation there. I agree with you if that's what you're suggesting around how those costs get recognized and allocated. And it's not like, it's just, you know, I can only use my kind of Midwestern experience here. In a lot of places, what a state agency would do would say, here's fund categories, here's what's required, here's the allocation formula, the allocation model that you must use, and here's how we're gonna enforce that. And that's just not the model that that CAEP is taking with this. And so it means that if we're gonna have, you know, like policies around and procedures, that they're gonna arise from the interaction between each of you as members in consortia and the state office kind of working together to come up with best practices. That's my sense of it. So it's possible that until that happens, I don't know how much we'll really be able to get out of the fund source level data, frankly. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay, thank you. All right. What type of designation would student support services fall under? Do you mean what type of designation in terms of what program category? Because you could have student support services that are relevant for any of the program categories, because it's a generic service that applies to all of your students. So it's part of the cost of running a particular program. So I think the program hours of instruction and expenditures follow the student and the program that they're in or programs that they're in. And that would include costs associated with your support services. You're not tracking support hours, but you are tracking expenditures of all kinds. And that would be one type of expenditure, but it needs to follow the program that that student is in. And if there are multiple programs, their costs have to be allocated across the program categories. That's my understanding. And if others would have something else they'd like to say, please, at the state level, please weigh in. I'm wondering how schools are planning to report in-kind funding with distance learning. We always calculated in-kind by the rate charged to the public to use district facilities, the number of hours that are in classrooms. We don't have our own facility, but obviously we aren't using facilities right now, right? So you had a mechanism, a very clever mechanism for keeping track of that stuff that just got blown up by COVID-19 because everything's happening distance-wise. That strikes me as exactly the kind of question I think that you need to be working on as a group in your consortia, you know, and through this dialogue about, you know, finding and sharing best practices. And if there are consortia or members out there that have given thought to this, it would be great to hear what you have to say about it. I don't necessarily have a suggestion about how to allocate those costs or how to identify in-kind costs when you're not using facility itself, because I mean, you're going to be again, though, so you might skip over this process and use prior allocations as a way of proxying for what's going on, I suppose, but as a temporary measure. But if we have long-term changes in the way you do your business, then that could affect that too. Right. Yeah, I get your point, Andrew, there about the allocation assumptions. I do think if it was me, and it isn't, but I mean, if it was me, one thing I would be doing that I'm not sure is happening is I would be asking each consortium to document how it's doing, how its members are doing what they're doing. Particularly, and frankly, I would encourage them to have their members follow some standard procedure. And which I don't know, that might not be a popular thing to say, but I would do that, and I would encourage consortia to document what they're up to in a way that could be tracked back to what you're actually reporting. Because this is a moving target and things do change over time, and we don't have standardized allocation requirements, procedures for allocation, if you will, allocation rules. And so in the absence of that, the only way to get to good practice is to gather data about what people are doing and start comparing notes. And frankly, you know, it's possible that one of the reasons we are seeing some really big shifts from year to year, even at the member level, is because allocation processes altered from year to year. And so you get different, you know, students being allocated different programs differently. So that could, you know, that can make things look a lot different than they actually are in the real world. Okay. Need to be careful on how percent hours and percent expenditures is used, because K-12 dollars have to cover facilities costs I don't believe are counted in community college expenditures. Yes, so in other words, when you're saying that, look, we have costs greater than maybe hours because we have certain kinds of costs that aren't getting picked up that other types of entities don't have. So that, I mean, maybe the larger point is that these two types of providers aren't directly comparable to each other. I think we recognize that. So I think it's an important point, though, because you have. Oh, that was your answer to her question. Good, thank you. And they still, okay, that's more on the issue of costs, how costs get recognized. Yeah, okay, well, Chris, so that's good. I mean, there are 0 hours of instruction, but there still are services. So to me, though, this is the question that raises. If you're not, if the policy is that you're not tracking service hours, right? But you are tracking instructional hours and expenditures, then we just need a resolution of that, it seems to me. Because if the mission is not instructional, fundamentally, then I'm not sure why you're in the reporting domain for this. Because the only way to be in it is to have some hours. And it just, to me, I don't know, that's just my point. I think it's just more straightforward if you say, this is what this is. This is about instructional hours and it's about expenditures for those instructional hours. And that includes everything else I'm doing for the student. But if all I'm providing is services, then what? And I think if there's not, we have to have clarity on that, or I think we're all just going to be bedeviled by this question of people with expenditures but no hours of instruction, because we've restricted one and not the other. I think that's my problem with it. We think we need to be consistent in how we treat that. Okay, this is that Grace's response to Diana on custodial services, etc. Okay, this is good. There's dialogue. I like it. Some community colleges have facility costs and the courses and programs that are offered at off-site location. Yes. Right. I mean, so costs are costs, whether the cost is on campus or off campus, it's still costs and should be recognized as such. But yeah, not obviously. Now we're in the middle of COVID, all this stuff is thrown, off the rails. So, but we're assuming and hoping that, there'll be some kind of return to normal operating procedures here in a year or so. Okay. Hours of instruction by program area. The term hours of instruction is defined as any reportable individual that has at least 1 hour of program related services or instruction. That was the definition given in the budget bill requirements. I'm reading that that related services also service hours. Am I understanding this correctly? I think so, but I would rather have someone from CAEP office give you a definitive answer on that. But yeah, I think so. Veronica, do you have an opinion on that or not?
No, I do not, but I'm capturing the conversation as well as the outstanding questions that the CAEP office will be weighing in on. I'm going to be reporting back to them after this webinar. And so if there are any additional questions that we are unable to address here, I'll be relaying that information. So type them in the chat or send them to tap@caladoed.org, and I'll include it in a package of questions that they'll be addressing. And I'm also going to propose, if there are additional questions or additional discussion that needs to take place, I'm going to propose that we set up another CAEP office hour so that everyone can come on and ask those questions with members from the CAEP office.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's great. So yeah, Andrew, I appreciate this comment here, and that you're right, that could have something to do with what's going on with the fact that we're not seeing that strong enough a relationship that we thought we might see between some of those things. It's just that there's different allocation rules at work. And I agree that, exchanging better information about how that's happening maybe is a good way to, something productive to do as we move forward. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, what if you do both instruction and services? Yeah, you do, and then those are costs that are associated with that student and become expenditures for that student with appropriate allocation, but your hours are hours of instruction. Oh, you're disagreeing with me. I appreciate that, Andrew. Test of independence? Oh, yeah, I mean, I didn't look at these correlation between hours and expenditures, for instance. I had previously looked at that at the program level. I didn't do that for this round because they just didn't want to put the time into it. But I mean, that's something that could be done, and I'm sure you would see maybe some big differences there. Clearly, in those program categories that are driving the predominant hours and expenditures, AB, ESC, ESL. The short-term CTE, those would be, I would expect to see those relationships hold up there reasonably well and be completely missing in all the little ones. Because when you just have small numbers of observations, you generally don't see these correlations that aren't worth a darn anyway. So I wouldn't worry about those other categories. But I think that it's helpful to maybe look at it for the big categories where we have most of the money in hours. And see if those things are really radically different by, say, provider type, for instance. That would be helpful and get some additional insight on what's going on. It's a cost allocation methodology issue. Yeah, probably. It probably is. Can you please read the question statement out loud? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm trying, I have done that in some cases, but not always, and I apologize for that. But I think what we can do is maybe, Veronica, maybe put together some answers to these questions in writing. I could maybe do that, or we could do that based, are you recording this?
Yes.
That might be something I could do. Okay, so to what extent did you look at intra-consortium correlation, i.e. are some consortia reporting expenditures and hours more reliably and consistently than others? I did not look at compliance like within consortia, if you mean. I did not do that. I just looked at like overall, but it could be done. I mean, we could look at, we know who like the people that had difficulty with this, like who had 0 hours or 0 expenditures or had very low, extreme values. I mean, we know who they are, so we could identify those folks and then say, okay, where are they disproportionately from particular consortia? So in other words, is the issue at consortia level, or is it just at the member level? So that wouldn't be terribly difficult to do if the CAEP office wanted to, kind of follow up with individual members or consortia to say, hey, we think you might have an issue with, you might have an issue with this particular aspect of the reporting requirement. He would suggest that statewide best practice allocation rules would be better than consortium by consortium rules. Well, I agree. But it's just difficult, I think, you've got 400 members and, $800 million of money and 70 plus consortia, and trying to get everybody pointing in the same direction at the same time is hard. So I think that's maybe why that hasn't happened, but I personally would be a big fan of some kind of best practice rules, or maybe not one way of doing it. There isn't probably a single way of doing it. There might be 3 or 4 good ways of doing it, though. And if we could discover what those were, and I'll try to, I'll agree that we're going to pick one of them, that would be better and probably give us better data over time. I think we need to count service/support hours and define those. Okay. A message received. We could report program costs by major object range, and that will help understand, compare these parameters better. Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand what you mean by major object range, but I agree that it's better to start identifying, procedures for doing this and trying to get to some level of standardization, however that's done, over time. Question, how are we reporting 1920 hours of instruction? In other words, do you mean by that, have any changes been made for hours of instruction reporting for this next round? That unfortunately is a CAEP office question I can't answer. I don't think there are major changes, but that's something we need to follow up on. To Yudi's point, it seems like the split would be instructional hours A, B, service hours with enrollment, C, service hours without enrollment. Okay, but again, that's certainly true, but I think part of what's going on here, and this is Greg's question, I think part of what's going on is that, they're trying to deliver a reporting instruction requirement, but do it in a way that doesn't literally cause people to lose their minds, right? So if the more complicated you make it, this is like the trade-off. It might be more accurate in principle to have all these different variations of hours of instruction and services, et cetera. But what happens when you take that and then try to allocate it across programming categories, et cetera, it just becomes impossibly complicated. And then you just don't get compliance, frankly. And I think that's the challenge from the state level of trying to balance out these competing interests of getting interesting, useful data, but also getting people to actually comply with the reporting requirement. And as you can see from the data that we did on the instructional stuff, on the compliance, there's a lot of folks out there that are struggling with just the requirements that are already there. So I think that is an issue. I think that you need to struggle with as a community about how to put, where to put your emphasis and your time and effort on this reporting requirement. Yeah, Andrew's suggestions, there probably should be two different sets of rules for allocation of, I'm assuming you mean one for K-12 and one for community colleges. And that does make sense because those institutions function very differently. They're fundamentally different types of organizations, particularly as regards supplemental services, et cetera. So yeah, that's a good point. Greg, isn't that how TE does the differential numbers? That I don't know. And I'm looking for questions here. We're kind of over time here though, Veronica. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think I got to the bottom. I'm not sure I got everything, and I apologize if I didn't read off the questions as I was going, but we can go back and kind of revisit, Veronica and I, and sort of see maybe we can get some things compiled together to get out to folks. But those are all really good questions. I appreciate that. And but we've kind of gone over our time, so I wanted to bring this to a halt if that's okay with you. I'm going to turn the screen back over to you, Veronica.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you all very much for your questions and your comments and the discussion that was going on within the chat. As I mentioned before, the webinar is being recorded and we are saving the chat, and we'll be relaying all of the issues and discussion that came up that were unable to be resolved at this time. And as I stated before, I'm going to propose to the CAEP office that we hold an office hours so that people can come and drop in and ask those questions or engage in further discussion about the outstanding issues that are still available at this time. So, sorry, I had one more thing that I wanted to say, but yes, that's pretty much the gist of it. So thank you all very much for your time and your participation. Again, if you have additional questions that you would like to include in this package that I'm going to be sending to the CAEP office, definitely feel free to pop them in the chat right now, or feel free to contact TAP at tap@palodoed.org, and we will be sure to include your questions and your comments, concerns, whatever the case may be. These program area reporting, so the estimates are due on September the 1st. However, the actuals are not due until December the 1st. So we still have time to work out these issues. And if for some reason you can't submit by September 1st, definitely just let us know, and we will let the CAEP office know that because of XYZ reason, we are unable to submit the estimates at this time. So thank you all very much for your time and your participation, and I appreciate you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.